Now, we are nearing the end of this series we've been doing on women of the Bible. This week with me, Trish is doing next week as well, so looking forward to that. But for today, we're going to look at another Old Testament character this week by the name of Abigail. But before we get to her, it's worth knowing a little bit about her husband. He was a wealthy sheep farmer called Nabal. In fact, we're told in 1 Samuel that Nabal had 1,000 goats and 3,000 sheep. I don't know how you count 3,000 sheep without falling asleep, but let's reckon 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats he had, which is a lot of livestock to keep an eye on. Now, this was also the time, though, of these two, that David was growing in influence as the people's true leader, we might say. If you recall, this is David of David and Goliath fame, who would eventually become king of Israel. But at this stage of the story, David's keeping a lower profile out in the desert because the current king, King Saul, saw him as a threat and was trying to kill him. So David kept his head down. So David's this kind of king in waiting, if you like, who's trying to look after the scattered desert tribes of Israel, in particular by protecting people's livestock from predators and thieves. So you'd have thought, as a major livestock owner, Nabal should have been very grateful to David for looking after all of his animals. Except when David sent some of his men to ask Nabal for a few of his sheep so that they could hold a feast, Nabal, he says no. Indeed, he replies this way. He says, "Who is this David? Why should I take my bread and water and the meat I have slaughtered and give it to men coming from who knows where?" Now, not only is this response, it seems pretty ungrateful, pretty greedy, given all that he's got, but it's also pretty foolish to insult the man who's protecting your livestock and who would one day be king. We say pretty foolish, and indeed Nabal's name means fool or moron. You want to think about his parents choosing that one for him, but his name means fool or moron, which I guess kind of sums him up a bit. And so on hearing this insult, it evidently got back to David. David understandably hits the roof. He straps on his sword, we're told. He gathers 400 of his men to go and teach Nabal what presumably would be a fatal lesson. But just as David's gearing up to pay Nabal a visit, Nabal's wife, Abigail, gets wind of what's about to happen because one of her servants says to her, he says, "David sent messengers from the wilderness to give our master, your husband, Nabal, his greetings, but he hurled insults at them. Yet these men were very good to us. Night and day they were a wall around us the whole time we were herding our sheep near them. Now think it over and see what you can do, because disaster is hanging over our master and his whole household. He's such a wicked man that no one can talk to him." Now, in stark contrast to her fool of a husband, Abigail is a wise, clever woman, because in response to this news, we're told this, that Abigail, she acted quickly. She took 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, 5 dressed sheep, 60 pounds of roasted grain, 100 cakes of raisins, and 200 cakes of pressed figs, and loaded them on donkeys. Then she told her servants, "Go on ahead, I'll follow you." But she did not tell her husband Nabal. As she came riding her donkey into a mountain ravine, there were David and his men descending toward her, and she met them. She quickly got off her donkey, bowed down before David with her face to the ground, and fell at his feet. She's obviously aware that she needs to mop up the mess that her husband has created, and she acts decisively and quickly, generously, humbly, and wisely, bringing food for David and his troops and greeting David with respect. But more than that, it seems she's a woman of real wisdom because she makes one of the bravest and longest speeches by a woman that we have recorded in the Old Testament. I won't read it all because it is a long one, but here's the gist of what she says directly to David. She says, "Upon me alone, my Lord, David, be the guilt. Please hear the words of your servant. My Lord, do not take seriously this ill-natured fellow Nabal. He is just like his name, a fool. But since I, your servant, did not see the young men who you sent, please accept these gifts for your men as a token of my gratitude. I know the Lord your God will make a lasting dynasty for you because you fight the Lord's battles and no wrongdoing will be found in you as long as you live. So forgive my presumption, but you surely do not need the burden of needless bloodshed on your conscience. In other words, please don't kill my husband, all right? It's evident, though, that Abigail is wise enough to know how to handle David. It's a speech, she's buttering him up, basically. It's full of sort of compliments and humility, of generosity, but also persuasive reason, asking David not to harm Nabal because he doesn't need that on his conscience, does he? And her swift and her skilled diplomacy obviously works because David then said to Abigail, "Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who has sent you today to meet me. May you be blessed for your good judgment and for keeping me from bloodshed this day and from avenging myself with my own hands." Then David accepted what she'd brought him and said, "Go home in peace. I have heard your words and granted your request." So it's a triumph, really, of courage and diplomacy for Abigail, saving her husband's bacon by knowing what was needed and how people should be treated. Sadly, though, Nabal doesn't learn his lesson. He remained ungrateful to the end because when Abigail told him what she'd done, we're told Nabal had a heart attack and died 10 days later. Well, in a further little plot twist, David then sends for Abigail and we're told that she became his third wife. So they got together as well. But that's kind of peripheral stuff in some ways because I think more lasting than those details, I'd suggest Abigail's story is an inspirational one because it speaks not only of her bravery and her wisdom, but also of the importance of being diplomatic, of knowing not just what to say, but the right way to say it. And that's a rare gift. I don't always get that right at all. Being a peacemaker and smoothing over difficulties, resolving conflict, that's not easy to do, but Abigail gets it. Especially, it seems, when she knows, as Abigail did about her husband, that someone is being a bit of an idiot, to be honest. Displaying patience and grace and being the better, brighter person, I'd suggest she's got that in spades. We see it in abundance in Abigail. Now, I don't know if we sort of think about how this might apply for our lives. I don't know if there are tricky situations or people in our lives, in your life, perhaps people who you find yourself having to bite your tongue a bit, maybe to gently reason with or be extra diplomatic with. Maybe there are folks in your family or colleagues or friends or neighbours who need handling with care. Maybe you find yourself having to play the peacemaker from time to time. If so, I think I'd suggest that we can take heart from Abigail's approach because it seems it's in that diplomacy, that peacemaking, that God is at work and able to bring a positive outcome. Yes, like Nabal, those we try to help may not always appreciate it, but Abigail is held up in the Bible as an example, I think, of the way God can provide us with the right words and the right manner and the right actions at the right time to ensure good outcomes between people. And so as with all the other women, I think, that we've been looking at, Abigail is one who we can learn from. So the next time we're faced with a difficult or challenging situation, let's maybe ask God for the wisdom and the courage and the diplomacy of Abigail. Amen.